Doug, welcome to the show.
Hey, Dr. Vic, great to be here.
I'm excited to have you on this. I'm already pumped to dive deep in some of the things we were just chatting about prior to getting on to the recording here. And I'm excited for the listeners, get ready to tune into some great stuff. But before we get into that, I always love to know the backstory. How'd you get into, or what inspired you to go into what you're doing today?
Well, it was a long journey. I grew up in Southern California. I was born in 1950, but I was born with a lot of disabilities. I was born almost blind, partially deaf, crippled, two club feet, couldn't walk until I was 3 years old. Just a myriad of problems. And in those days, nobody knew what to do with it. I was left-handed too. That had an insult to injury. But I was born with a really good mind, and so I had a very difficult. Even though I grew up in affluence, I had a very difficult childhood emotionally. But ultimately, because of my intellect, I was able to get admitted to Dartmouth College and went to Dartmouth, and then came back to California after college and went to law school and moved to Central California and became a trial lawyer. And I did that for 22 years. In the mid 1980s, as I was building my trial practice, I took up the martial arts, and I was awarded my second degree black belt in right around my 40th birthday, 1990. And then my teacher said, go learn Tai Chi. And so I started studying Tai Chi. And Tai Chi had two very interesting paradoxes. The first is the softer you are, the stronger you are. And the second is the more vulnerable you are, the more powerful you are. Soft to be strong, vulnerable to be powerful. Well, I did not get this at first. It didn't resonate. But eventually it did, until one day I was in a trial and I thought, what the heck am I doing in here? And at that point, that was the change in my life. And after that trial, I was on a river trip, whitewater rafting with a bunch of friends, and came back from that river trip and decided I wasn't going to be a trial lawyer anymore, but I didn't know what I was going to do. And as I was driving out of the mountains to my home, to my office from my home, I heard a public service announcement for a brand new master's degree program in peacemaking and conflict studies being offered at Fresno Pacific University, which was a West Coast Mennonite university. And it piqued my attention. And ultimately I enrolled, and it completely changed my life. I learned so much about human conflict and the causes of conflict and the history of conflict. And it got me into neuroscience. And that's when I started being tutored by a neuroscientist at Caltech, a guy by the name of John Allman. So ultimately, in 2000, I walked away from my law practice. I was a senior partner, walked away from 10 million bucks on the table, more money than I'd put in than I'd taken out, and started my own peacemaking and mediation practice. And that's how it all began. The problem I had was that I didn't have any good ways for calming people down. None of the stuff that I'd studied, either active listening, the old Thomas Gordon stuff, or Marshall Rosenberg's NVC, nonviolent communication, all that was garbage to me. It just didn't work. And I was being called into high conflict situations, being paid big bucks, where I had to calm people down right away. Well, in 2005, I had been doing a lot of studying of the emotions, the neuroscience of emotions. And in 2005, when faced with a really difficult mediation, I stumbled on The Secret. And I took that case, and when the people were done with the process that I just invented on the fly in the moment, the ex-husband looked across at his ex-wife and said, that's the first time you've listened to me in 25 years. And 4 hours before, there would have been blood on the floor if there had been knives on the table, and they walked out holding hands and had lunch with each other. And my jaw dropped. I said, wow, what did I just do? So I figured it out, and 3 years later, a brain scanning study came out of UCLA, out of Lieberman's lab, that completely showed what was going on, and the science behind why what I had figured out worked. And so I started teaching it to other mediators and people who were peacemakers, and had kind of a small audience of people who are very skeptical because it's so counterintuitive and different than what we think we know about listening. So then the Prison of Peace Project started with my colleague Laurel Coffer and I in 2010, when we were called into the largest, most violent women's prison in the world to train 15 women serving life sentences, all murderers, how to become peacemakers and mediators. And this is the first skill we taught them. And the transformation was just absolutely remarkable. So today, prison of peace continues, and we're in 15 California prisons, 12 prisons in Greece, prisons in Italy, Nairobi. I mean, it's all over the place now. And the foundational skill is teaching people how to listen to other people into existence. And the more I taught this, the more I saw the transformation, the more I saw people's emotional competency go up and reduced conflict. And people were stopping fights and arguments in their families forever. And just going through these massive personal transformations from just practicing this one simple skill. So that's what I'm devoting my life to now, is teaching people how to do this stuff.
I love hearing that story. I think it's so critical in so many ways to just be able to give something like that to change people and shift them in a certain way. So lots of questions I have. I think the first one is, how have we been conditioned or been taught to listen that is not correct or not efficient enough? Or
we suffer from a number of disabilities as human beings. The first disability is that we live in a culture or a society that's based on what I call the myth of rationality. So for over 4,000 years, we've been trained by philosophers and theologians that what separates human beings from other species is our ability to reason. That's just an absolute lie. What neuroscience now establishes is that we are 98% emotional and only 2% rational. And our whole educational system is based on the myth of rationality, and the way we see ourselves as human beings in families is based on the myth of rationality. So parents, rather than being emotional coaches and training their kids how to listen properly, are actually abusing their children. Even the most loving parents, they don't even know they're doing this. So, and I'll just give you a quick example. You remember when you were 2 years old and you were out running around and you fell down and you skinned your knee and you started to cry. What were you told?
Get back up.
Yep. Be tough. Don't cry. Don't be a girly girl. Big boys don't cry. Shove it. Stuff it. Be tough. That's called emotional invalidation. And what the studies show is that when children are invalidated, it literally destroys the developing emotional centers of their brain, and they become emotionally stuck at about 6 years old. What that means is they never mature beyond 6 years old emotionally. So we grow into these adult physical bodies, and we learn how to fake it. But really, we have the emotional maturity of children. And so whenever there's any stress or triggering event, we immediately and reactively and unconsciously revert back to that 6-year-old. And this is the origin of all fights and conflicts. So we're stuck. We've got a culture that privileges rationality over emotions. I teach a graduate course in decision making, and I can tell you there is no such thing as rationality. You can't find a good definition of rationality out there. It's a myth. So we've got this myth out there that permeates our total culture. We've got an educational system that's based on the myth of rationality and only educates one system in our brain, the task-focused system, completely ignoring the most important system in our brain called the default mode or social system in our brain. Education doesn't even touch that. And then we have this family dysfunction where we've got all these myths around making kids tough and, toughening them up so they can get into the real world through emotional invalidation, which does exactly the opposite of making them tough. It makes them very weak. And that's the problem we have today. And we have to reverse this. And it's easy. The concept is simple. Instead of emotionally invalidating, learn how to emotionally validate each other.
I love that, because there's something I share often, and I always say, and I do this from a consciousness conditioning, programming of the mind in some way, is that where most adults are just big children. That's phrase right. I use very often. So when you were talking like that, I was like, yep, exactly. I love what you're saying here. So how, because it's one of those things, I was that kid who did not, and I know most people were. For me, it was always emotional validation. You got this, rub it off. You're upset, just put them in, go in the corner, and you figure that out. When you're ready, you come back.
Right.
And not, it did good in it, but it did bad also. And it's one of those things where one of my issues were, and this is a question I have for you then, is that It took me a while to learn how to connect to my emotions and verbalize what I was actually feeling and why. It
Correct.
took a lot of inner work to get to that point to where I'm now. I can be like, oh, I feel this way because this is what I feel. Here's I can even get to the point of like this is the conditioning I've had in my life from back in so and so. The reason why I'm feeling this way, and this is why it affects me like this. Let me take a deep breath. Let me reset, and then let's. This is my wife's really good with this. She's God bless her soul. But how can someone then? Because I had a lot of disconnect to that. How can someone connect to learn how to understand that emotion, the emotions that they're feeling, to start that journey? In other words.
Right. So it's one practice will do it all. One practice, you don't have to do any deep inner work. I did a lot of deep inner work too. It was hard, really hard, painful. You don't have to do that. If you just do this one practice, and it's called listening others into existence. 3-step process. You're in front of let's just say you're confronted by an angry child or an angry grandchild. And the first thing you've got to do is ignore those angry words. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter whether it's an adult spitting on you and screaming at you and insulting you, and you just ignore the words. Because if you don't ignore the words, you're going to get triggered and get reactive. So just ignore them. It's just white noise. Second thing you do is you read the emotion. You read their emotions. Now here's because of this, all these barriers we have to around emotions. We never develop this innate ability we have to read each other's emotions with exquisite efficiency and accuracy. And we can read each other's emotions really, really easily. All we have to do is just let ourselves do it. And this goes back to evolutionary biology. Why is it that we have this ability? It's because it evolved. It was highly adaptive. Humans did not begin to speak. There was no proto-vocabulary before 230,000 years ago. So the only way hominids were able to communicate with each other, other than through grunts, was through emotional expression. And so our brains evolved to read emotions. But the myth of rationality prevents us from developing that ability. So number 2, we read the emotions. And then the third thing we do, and this is the secret sauce, is we reflect back the emotion with a simple you statement. So Vic, supposing you were really upset, I would say something like this. Vic, man, you're really pissed off. You're angry. You're frustrated. You feel completely disrespected. Nobody's listening to you. You feel completely ignored and unappreciated. And you're sad. And you're feeling a little embarrassed. And you feel completely and totally betrayed. Nobody gets you. Nobody loves you. You feel completely abandoned. And it's really, really upsetting. When I reflect your emotions in the way that I just did, using a you statement, what the brain scanning studies show out of Lieberman's lab is that the emotional centers of the brain are inhibited. At the same time, the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the executive function of our brain, is activated. So when we get reactively emotional, the emotional centers of the brain, which is much, much larger in mass compared to the prefrontal cortex, just completely overwhelms us. And we've all had this experience. And we just lose it. And all we've got is reactive programming to fall back on because we can't think. But when you affect label somebody, that's what this is called, affect labeling. When you affect label somebody, you label their emotions, reflect back their emotions. This magic happens in the brain where the emotional centers are quieted while the thinking part of our brain comes back online. It's all science. It's how every human brain is designed. It doesn't matter what culture you're in, or how old you are, or how young you are. And it works every single time without fail. Without fail. So you can calm any angry person in 90 seconds or less every single time once you get this thing figured out. It's amazing.
That's pretty cool. No, because even when you were just saying, I was thinking, I'm like, if I'm in an argument with him right now, and then as soon as you said you, this and that, immediately I was like reflecting in my head, going, all right, am I like this? Am I feeling this? Am I feeling that? Where the words you were throwing at me, I'm like, what I feel, just in just playing a scenario in my head. And I was just like, yeah, it actually, that's like putting me in check in the words of like, just getting, again, lowering down that emotional response and really getting more into that thinking kind. So when you get someone to that point, is there a process after that, or is it like you the melting of the walls come down and
everything?
Everything?
Yes, 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 and yes. Oftentimes, When you've calmed somebody down, you're done. But sometimes you can then engage in problem solving. So I would say, all right, so what do we need to do about this? How are we going to fix this? How do we make things right? And you just invite a conversation. And if people get re-escalated, you affect label again. Now, here are a couple other things that are really cool about this. Number one, if you affect label somebody else's emotions, you are now building your own emotional database. You're developing what's known as emotional categorization. And you are now able to put words to feelings that you're seeing other people have. And that is huge, huge. The other thing you can do is you can self-affect label yourself. So you can say, oh, I'm really angry right now. I'm really pissed off. I feel frustrated. I don't feel supported. I feel ignored. Just whatever feelings you're having, just label them yourself. And that strengthens the connection between the experience you're having and the concept of emotion that you're having, which is called emotional granularization. And that is the basis for all emotional intelligence once you start doing that. And you can engage in this practice for 4 to 6 weeks, you completely change as a human being. It's that fast. You don't need to do any of that deep dive stuff. It's good to do the deep dive stuff, but you don't need to do it in order to get through this transformation.
Oh, I wish I had this years ago. 4 to 6 weeks would be so much easier. Let me tell you.
Yeah, I watched this when we first walked into our first prison back in 2010, Valley State Prison for Women. It was the largest, most violent women's prison in the world. We were faced with 15 women who were the blackest thorns you could possibly imagine. And we taught them this skill. And by week 6, they had turned into beautiful roses. They were laughing. They were human beings. They'd gotten in touch with their emotions that had been totally repressed for years and years and years. I mean, it was just remarkable to see the difference. And we thought it kind of fluky. And then we did our next set of women, and the same thing happened at week 6. They all shifted. And then we've seen it ever since then. Now we've been in dozens of prisons, and we've seen it in every single kind of situation you can imagine. We've seen the transformation occur at 6 weeks.
Is there a reason why it hits every time at 6 weeks?
I think it takes that long for the brain to reprogram. You know, when we teach this, there's always a week or two of skepticism, and they got to get into the habit of practicing. And then once they start practicing and they start to see how powerful it is, and then they start practicing it more and more and more, and starts to accelerate, and they get some momentum going, and then all of a sudden the brain is starting to reprogram itself.
I love that. You brought up something on part 2 about reading emotions, and I'm curious to how to tap back into that, or you're kind of talking about just letting it flow. Just, we have it built into us. And
right.
Excuse me. And for me, I know I grew up, my sister was, she's 4 years older than me. So she was born a preemie, but she ended up being deaf. And one of the things she taught me very early on was sign language. But in that journey of being around a lot of deaf people, I have a natural inclination to pick up on body language and reading emotions. Then I learned that I wasn't just reading them, I was also reading the energy of it later on in my life. I figured that out. Right. That's what I was picking up on originally. Who knows if my sister, helped me in that journey? I have no idea, because that's just the way it went. Are there ways for people to dive deeper to be able to pick up? Because it's as a child, as a kids, sometimes your parents give you that look. They gave you that look with the eye, and when you were in trouble when that came out. So is it as simple as reading like that, or is there other things that someone can learn to enhance this or unleash, I should say, this ability?
Great question. What I have learned is that for most people, emotions are unstructured data. And if you've got to look at emotions as data, it's just like numbers on a spreadsheet. You just need to learn how to read it. But for most people who haven't gone through any training, it's all unstructured data. So you have to have a way to organize what you're perceiving into categories. And so I think of the 6 layers of emotion. And so if your people are listening, write down these layers, because this is a really good way to structure emotional data that will really help you nail what you're seeing, what you're perceiving. The top layer is anger, the anger emotions, mostly anger and frustration. The second layer are things like disrespect, not being heard, being ignored, not being appreciated, being treated unfairly. The third layer are the fear emotions, primarily fear, anxiety, scared, frightened, terrified, stuff like that. Fourth layer, shame, humiliation, embarrassment and guilt. Fifth layer, sadness and grief, worry, or sadness and grief mostly, yeah. Depression, distress, upset. And then the last layer is being abandoned, betrayed, unloved, and feeling unlovable. So you've got, now what you can do is go out on the web, and there are many, many lists of vocabulary of emotions, and you just plug the words that you would use with the way you speak into each of these different layers and pick 3 or 4 words. And then what you do is you start practicing. When you see somebody who's emotional, you just say, what's the first thing that I see? Oh, I see sadness. You're really sad, feeling a lot of grief. What's the next thing that I see? Oh, you feel like you've been completely abandoned and alone. And you're worried because you don't know what you're going to do. And you're really angry that you got left alone like this. It really pisses you off. And you see how I just move from layer to layer to layer. And I just follow the layers and just let my brain figure out, what am I seeing? All right, what layer is that? What are the words that I want to use? And, after you practice it for a little bit, and not very long, it becomes totally automatic. You can do the same thing with positive emotions. We've got 2 positive affect. We're not born with emotions. We have to create these things we call emotions. But we have 2 positive affects, joy and excitement. And so you do the same thing, and you can build the layers of different kinds of positive emotions, and it works the same way. And then you tell people what they're feeling when they're positive, like a little kid. Hey, you're really excited, man. You're really jacked up. You're having so much fun. You can hardly stand it. And you tell a little kid how they're feeling.
I see the. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's how you do it.
I was gonna say, I see the structure behind this, and so it's like you got the 6 layers of emotions, and whatever one that you pick out, you can pretty much tie those words in that section, correct?
Correct. So you really only need a working vocabulary of 18 words to be able to nail most people's emotions. There was a great study done a year or 2 ago. 7,000 people were asked about what are the emotions you most commonly feel, and people said happy, sad, and pissed off. That was the extent of their emotional vocabulary. I mean, really unemotionally, very low emotional intelligence. And that's where most people are at. They don't know how to put feelings to words.
You've brought up the term a couple of times, emotional intelligence. Does that relate to some, and I forgot the name of the book, that kind of a work to elevating ourselves like that, or is this is completely different?
This is how you develop emotional intelligence. If you go to Goleman or any of the 10,000 other people that claim to teach you emotional intelligence on the website, they don't tell you how to do anything. They tell you what is emotional, and they don't even really explain what emotional intelligence is. Emotional intelligence, by the way, can't be taught. Emotional competency can be taught, but emotional intelligence is a measure of social intelligence developed by Solovey and Meyer back in 1992. And there were a couple of academic psychologists, researchers, and came up with this concept of emotional intelligence to measure different kinds of social intelligence that were not being measured by the Stanford-Binet IQ test. And so that's where the term came from. Goleman stumbled onto their work in 1993. He was the New York Times writer, has a PhD in psychology, a science writer, and took their work and went off in a completely different direction. He makes claims that are absolutely unsubstantiated by any kind of science. So you got to be careful. But we can increase emotional intelligence by developing 3 emotional competencies: self-awareness, self-regulation, and empathy. Develop those, and the way you develop awareness and self-regulation is by developing empathy first. So what I teach people is how do you do empathy? Label the emotions. Just by labeling the emotions, that's cognitive empathy, technical term, you will automatically increase your emotional self-awareness, and that will automatically increase your emotional self-regulation. It happens automatically.
That's so cool. I love this. I mean, the other thing too is, and just from my understanding, is that because we live in a society that there's been studies that show that we have very overgrown amygdalas because we're just from fear, stress, firing that those pathways so much. It's built up so much in those areas, and it's interesting because like I look at, from my understanding of neuroscience too, from left brain and right brain, like for example, in the work I did as a chiropractor, 80%, and there's no science on this. I just, from my own stuff, I've seen just from my practice evaluating left brain dominant versus right brain dominant individuals, 80% mostly roughly on the time were females, right brain dominant, and then males were left brain. And what was interesting is that I'm losing my train of thought. Oh yeah, when women, this is why women and men, how we come together for traditional relationships is that it's almost impossible neurologically, because when a woman gets emotional, you can't use logic in a sense with that. But the way you're kind of explaining this, I'm sitting there going, oh my goodness, you can definitely tap, because women they don't use verb. They can, I'm not saying they can't, but language tying to an emotion is sometimes hard. They feel something, but then their language can't really share specifically how they can explain that of where they specifically are, because they're so deep into the feeling side. But hearing this, I'm sitting there going, this is like a bridging the gap, in other words, to make that a possibility. And I know you already done that work. We talked about the prisoners and the female prisoners and murderers and so forth. So, but I can see how that will suppress the amygdala. And please tell me if there's any been studies or stuff you've looked into with this, with brain scans, to allow to open that door, that possibility to do just that. And I think that's fascinating.
That's exactly what Lieberman's study shows. His 2007 brain scanning study is the amygdalic response to the stress was reduced dramatically when you affect label. I would also say that its gender is unimportant. Men and women respond to this exactly the same way. The only, we have all kinds of stereotyping, cultural stereotyping that women are emotional, men are not. That's all bullshit. We're all emotional. And so affect labeling, we have just stereotyped gender roles that we force everybody into that creates its own set of problems. But this technique, this idea works cross-gender, cross-culture, everywhere. If it's a human brain, it'll work.
No,
it doesn't even have to be a well-functioning human brain.
Well, yeah, I mean, just looking at basic neuroscience, I'm like, it works, because it reduces that one response, which then we can open up the door to the other. And then I could see that working very well just from that process alone. Very, very cool stuff. I love this. I'm trying to think if I have another question here. I'm looking through. I have a ton of notes. Rarely do I have this much notes with a guest, so I appreciate this type of your wealth of knowledge you're sharing. How can people find you, follow you, the work you're doing, what you're doing, how you're helping people, and all that you're doing? Because I think it's fascinating. I think I love the angle you take, the approach you're doing with this, and I can definitely see it just from my knowledge of what I know. So how can I follow you and find you?
So I built up for everybody who's listening. I built up a page just for the audience, and that'll get you into my website. And the page is dougnoll.co/Dr-Fick. dougnoll.co/Dr-Fick. That will take you to a page that will get you into my website. On the page, you can get a free ebook that explains everything that I was talking about, 25-page ebook. You can get a copy of my fourth book, De-Escalate. You can buy a video course, several video courses I have, one on how to calm an angry person, the other one on how to build your emotional intelligence. And then from there, you can go into the rest of the website. The other asset that I have out there that might be useful to people is to check out my YouTube channel. This is a pretty new channel, but I'm populating it quickly with videos. The Power of Emotional Competency. So if you type in and search in Google for Doug Noll, Power of Emotional Competency, you'll come to that channel. And I've already got 30 videos up that cover all kinds of topics, like how to use your emotions to make better decisions, how to use your emotions as a man, how to manage your emotions as a woman, all these different ideas that I take common problems that we all experience and then how we use these tools. So those are the two ways to get at me. And then people can email me. I'm a sole practitioner living in rural California. I don't have an entourage. I don't sit on a 40-story building out over a big city. I'm just who I am. Doug@dougnoll.com. .com is the real website. Dougnoll.co is not the website. It's just a link. So yeah, email me at doug@dougnoll.com. I respond to all my own emails, and I'm happy to answer questions or schedule Zoom calls. I do coaching and teaching and training and all that stuff. So
Awesome, Doug. I greatly appreciate the work you're doing. I think it's critical in so many ways, and to be able to just be able to create a transformation like that in 6 weeks when traditional stuff can't even do it in 6 months or beyond is just. I love hearing stuff like this. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thanks for taking time to join us on the Mindful Experiment podcast and share your wisdom and your gifts with our community.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's my pleasure.